Story 1. A few years ago, I was driving home from work after an exhausting day. It was a late night, and I was starving. My stomach was growling, reminding me that I hadn't eaten in hours. I usually drive straight home, but on that night, I was desperate to find something to eat. As I drove along the highway, I noticed a sign for a Subway off the next exit. It was unusual because I hadn't seen this particular location before, even though I had taken this route many times. Curious and hungry, I decided to check it out. I pulled off the highway and made my way to the Subway. The building was dimly lit, but I could see the glow of the open sign in the window. There were no other cars in the parking lot, which struck me as odd, especially since it was still early enough that they should have had at least one customer. I parked my car and walked to the entrance. When I opened the door, it chimed softly, announcing my arrival. Inside, the place was eerily quiet, and the lights were much dimmer than they appeared from outside. There was no one at the counter, but I figured the employee was in the back and would come out when they heard the door. I walked up to the counter, but still, no one appeared. Just as I was about to call out, the light suddenly flickered and then went out completely, plunging the restaurant into near darkness. The only light was coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what was happening. That's when I heard the faint sound of footsteps coming from the back of the store, slowly getting closer. My heart started to race as I squinted into the darkness, trying to see who it was. A man emerged from the shadows, but he wasn't wearing a Subway uniform. He was dressed in dark, tattered clothes, and there was something unsettling about the way he moved. He didn't say anything, just stood there staring at me. Feeling uneasy, I decided it was best to leave. I turned to head towards the door. The man began to move too, following me. I glanced back and saw that he was now walking quickly, almost as if he was trying to catch up with me. I didn't wait to find out what he wanted. I bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. As I pushed the door open, I heard his footsteps getting faster. I ran to my car, fumbling with the keys as I tried to unlock it. Finally, I got the door open and jumped inside. The man was just a few feet away as I slammed the door shut. I quickly started the car and sped off, leaving him standing in the parking lot, staring after me. I didn't stop driving until I was safely back home. To this day, I have no idea what was going on in that Subway. Maybe the man was a vagrant, or maybe something more sinister was at play. All I know is that I'm glad I got out of there when I did. After that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. I replayed the events in my mind over and over, trying to make sense of it all. Was it a simple case of bad timing, or was there something more to it? The Subway itself seemed almost abandoned, and the man, there was something about him that just didn't sit right with me. A few weeks later, I was driving by the same exit. I had no intention of stopping again. Curiosity got the better of me. I decided to take a quick detour and see if the Subway was still there. As I approached, I noticed that the building was now completely boarded up. There was a for lease sign out front, and it was clear that the place had been shut down for some time. Couldn't help but wonder if the events of that night had anything to do with the closure. Had something happened that I wasn't aware of? Or was it just a coincidence? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Eventually, I decided to do a little digging. I searched online for any news about the Subway or any incidents that might have occurred there. To my surprise, I found an article from a local news site dated a few months before my encounter. It mentioned that the Subway had been the site of a break-in and that the perpetrators had never been caught. The article didn't provide many details, but it did mention that the employees had been unharmed, but were understandably shaken. This revelation sent chills down my spine. Had I stumbled into the aftermath of another break-in that night? Or was the man I saw somehow connected to the previous incident? The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I might never know the truth. Despite the lingering questions, I tried to put the incident behind me. I focused on my work and my daily routine, but every now and then, something would trigger a memory of that night. Flickering light, the sound of footsteps in a quiet room, or even the sight of a Subway restaurant would bring it all rushing back. I began to avoid that exit altogether, taking a longer route home just to avoid the unsettling memories. Seemed like a small price to pay for some peace of mind. But even with these precautions, the memory never fully faded. It remained a haunting reminder of how quickly a seemingly ordinary night take a dark turn. Looking back now, I realize that the experience changed me in subtle ways. More cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and less likely to take things for granted. It's a lesson I never expected to learn from a late-night drive home and a Subway sandwich. To anyone listening to this story, I hope it serves as a reminder to trust your instincts and stay alert, even in the most mundane situation. You never know what might be lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Story 2. I've never told anyone this before, but I need to get it off my chest. It's something so chilling that it still makes my blood run cold every time I think about it. It all began with what seemed like a normal shift at Subway, but it spiraled into a 3-day nightmare that turned my world upside down. I worked the closing shift at Subway, a routine job that seemed harmless enough. It was a quiet night when I first noticed him, a man who walked into the store around 5 p.m., just as the dinner rush was beginning. He stood out immediately. He wore an old trench coat and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, making it hard to see his features clearly. The moment he walked in, a chill seemed to settle over the store. It was an unsettling feeling, one I couldn't quite place. The restaurant was busy, and I was caught up in the flurry of sandwich making and order taking. The man stood in line, and his gaze never left me. He wasn't just looking in my direction, he was staring, intensely. Felt as if his eyes were boring into me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. When his turn finally came, I tried to keep my composure as I took his order. His voice was soft, almost too soft, and his manner was peculiar. I noticed how he seemed to deliberately avoid any direct interaction, almost as if he was trying to blend into the shadows of the store. I tried to forget about him, focusing on my tasks. But every time I glanced up, he was still there, watching me. The night dragged on, and the man finally left. I thought that would be the end of it, but as my shift was ending, I saw him again. He was standing outside, staring through the large front windows. I tried to ignore him, but the sight of him made my skin crawl. It was as if he was waiting for something, or someone. After closing time, I quickly gathered my things and left. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I drove home in a daze, constantly checking my rearview mirror. I locked all the doors and windows when I got home, but the sense of unease followed me. I slept fitfully, waking up multiple times throughout the night, convinced that someone was lurking outside. The next day, I returned to work, hoping that the previous night was just a fluke. But as soon as I walked into the store, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. The atmosphere seemed different, colder, heavier. It was as if the restaurant had absorbed the fear from the night before. That evening, the store was quieter than usual. The man didn't appear, but there was an eerie silence that seemed to permeate the place. The lights flickered intermittently, casting strange shadows on the walls. I tried to focus on my work, but the strange occurrences only heightened my anxiety. Around closing time, the power went out. The restaurant was plunged into darkness, with only the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the windows. My coworker, Sarah, and I fumbled around in the dark, trying to locate the emergency lights. The darkness felt almost alive, oppressive, and the usual hum of the refrigerator had turned into a low, disconcerting growl. Sarah went to check the back room while I stayed behind the counter. That's when I saw him again. The man. He was standing in the middle of the floor, his eyes glowing with an unsettling, otherworldly light. The cold in the room was so intense that I could see my breath. I tried to call out to Sarah, but my voice was barely a whisper against the growing cacophony of whispers that seemed to fill the room. The shadows on the walls twisted and danced, creating grotesque shapes that seemed to move on their own. The whispers grew louder, and I could feel a palpable sense of malevolence in the air. My heart was pounding, and I felt paralyzed with fear. The man didn't move. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on me. Desperate to escape, I stumbled outside into the freezing night air. I ran to my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. As I drove away, I glanced back and saw the man standing in the parking lot, watching me with that same eerie, unblinking stare. I drove home, too frightened to stop anywhere else, and spent the night in a state of terrified vigilance. I took a few days off from work, hoping that things would return to normal. But when I returned, the horror had only deepened. Sarah was missing. Her belongings were still at the restaurant. She was nowhere to be found. The sense of dread that had been growing inside me was now a full-blown nightmare. The subway had been closed for a few days, and the restaurant was eerily quiet when I walked in. The place was in disarray, cobwebs in the corners, dust covering the counters, and a thick layer of grime on the windows. The atmosphere was heavy, and the once familiar surroundings now felt alien and hostile. As I walked through the store, I noticed something chilling. There were strange symbols etched into the walls. Symbols I didn't recognize. It was as if something had been scratched into the surface with a desperate hand. The darkness seemed to cling to every corner of the restaurant, and the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I went to the back room, hoping to find some clue about Sarah's disappearance. The back room was even more unsettling. It was filled with old, unused equipment and boxes that had been hastily stacked. In the corner, I found an old, dusty journal. Flipping through the pages, I discovered notes and drawings that hinted at some kind of ritualistic practices. The entries spoke of summoning shadows and communing with entities from another realm. The more I read, the more I felt the oppressive weight of fear settling over me. The symbols on the walls, the eerie whispers, and the man with the glowing eyes all seemed to connect to something far darker than I had ever imagined. The restaurant had become a nexus for something malevolent, and I felt like I was standing on the precipice of a nightmare. I left the subway, vowing never to return. The building was eventually shut down and abandoned. The memories of those 3 days linger on. Every time I pass by that old place, I can't help but feel a chill run down my spine. The subway, once a place of simple routine, had transformed into a dark and horrifying realm where I encountered fears I could never have imagined. The darkness that consumed that subway was real, and it left a mark on me that I can never erase. Every time I think about that night, I'm reminded of the terror that lurked just out of sight. A chilling reminder of the horrors that can unfold in the most unexpected places. I hope you understand now why I can't forget what happened. It's a nightmare that will never let me go. Story 3. It was a quiet spring night just over a year ago, and I had decided to make a quick trip to the nearby subway. The restaurant was only about 5 minutes from my house, and I was looking forward to a simple dinner after a long day. It was around 8 p.m. when I left my house, and the sky was already dark, casting a calm, eerie quiet over the strip mall where the subway was located. Most of the other businesses in the mall had closed, leaving the area desolate. As I walked into Subway, the store was surprisingly empty. I placed my order without delay, and soon, I was holding my sandwich and drink. The only other person in the store was the clerk, who seemed as eager to finish their shift as I was to leave. I glanced out the window while filling my drink, and that's when I noticed a man walking by on the sidewalk outside. He was tall, with shaggy hair, wearing a t-shirt and sweatpants. His appearance wasn't particularly striking, but something about his presence made me uneasy. As he walked by, he looked into the window and caught my eye for a brief moment. His stare was unsettling, but he continued on his way, disappearing into the night. With my food and drink in hand, I left Subway and headed toward my car. The parking lot was nearly empty, the only sounds being the faint hum of distant traffic and the occasional rustle of leaves. As I approached my car, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned and saw the same man from outside Subway, his face partially hidden by the shadows. He was getting closer, and before I knew it, he was right next to me. He had a casual demeanor, but something about the way he approached felt invasive. He asked if I could give him a ride to the gas station, pointing in the direction. The gas station was within view and only a short distance away, almost behind the strip mall. Despite my initial reluctance, I agreed to give him a ride. In hindsight, I realized how foolish it was to pick up a stranger, but at that moment, I was hoping it would be a quick trip. The man climbed into the passenger seat, and I got into the driver's seat. As I drove, the silence was palpable. We didn't exchange a single word, and the awkwardness of the situation grew with every passing second. The drive to the gas station was brief, and I pulled into a space at the back of the lot. The man remained seated, not making any move to exit the car. I started to feel a deep sense of discomfort, and the situation began to feel more and more unsettling. I finally broke the silence, saying, "All right, have a good night," hoping to prompt him to leave. But he didn't move. The man continued to sit there, and the tension in the car was suffocating. I asked him if this wasn't the gas station he needed to go to, and he responded with irritation, saying that it wasn't the right one. He pointed further down the road in the opposite direction. This was confusing because I had assumed he wanted to go to this gas station. His reaction made me anxious. He seemed annoyed that I didn't know exactly where he wanted to go, and his irritation was growing palpable. I told him I wasn't going any further and needed to head home. The man's response was a mix of frustration and stubbornness. He refused to get out of my car, and I was left feeling trapped and vulnerable. My heart was racing. I didn't know if the man was dangerous or if something else was at play. Just as I was trying to figure out my next move, I saw a police car pull into the gas station's parking lot. Relief washed over me, and I considered alerting the officers, but before I could act, the man abruptly exited my car and walked quickly towards the gas station building. I seized the opportunity and drove away as fast as I could. My hands were trembling on the steering wheel, and the fear of the unknown drove me home. I didn't stop to check if the man was still around. I just wanted to get as far away from that situation as possible. When I got home, I was shaken. The encounter with that man left me deeply unsettled, and I couldn't stop replaying the events in my mind. What were his intentions? Why did he insist on going to a different gas station? The entire situation felt like a close call, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something dangerous. In retrospect, I'm grateful for the timely arrival of the police officer. The sight of the cop car seemed to be enough to make the man flee. That night remains a haunting memory, and I've learned to be more cautious and trust my instinct. It's a stark reminder of how quickly an ordinary situation can become threatening and how important it is to stay vigilant, even in seemingly mundane circumstances. Story 4. It was about 5 years ago when something unnerving happened to me, something I still can't shake from my memory. It was around noon on a seemingly ordinary workday. I decided to grab a quick bite at Subway. My office was just a short 5-minute walk from the restaurant, so it was a convenient choice. That day, though, there was an inexplicable unease that clung to me like a shadow. As I approached the subway, the bright afternoon sunlight seemed unusually harsh, and the usual buzz of the city felt muted. The restaurant was unexpectedly crowded, stark contrast to its usual calmness during lunch hours. A long line stretched from the counter to the entrance. I joined the line, feeling a subtle discomfort but brushing it off as mere nerves. While waiting, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was unfamiliar, and although I was tempted to answer, I decided against it. Moments later, a text message from the same number appeared. "I'm watching you from behind." My heart raced. I glanced over my shoulder subtly, trying not to make it obvious. The person directly behind me was an elderly woman engrossed in her phone, her attention elsewhere. The people behind her also appeared to be ordinary, but the message had already set me on edge. I tried to focus on the line moving forward, and eventually it was my turn to order. I hastened to make my selection, my mind still reeling from the unsettling text. After paying and receiving my sub, I quickly exited the restaurant, scanning the parking lot for any sign of the mysterious figure. There was nothing out of the ordinary, so I hurried back to my office. The rest of the workday passed in a blur. Every time my phone buzzed, I couldn't help but flinch. As the day ended and I drove home, the unsettling feeling returned. I was halfway through my drive when the same unknown number called again. With a deep breath, I answered. A gravelly voice on the other end said, "I'm still following you." The words sent a chill down my spine. I glanced in my rearview mirror, but the heavy traffic made it impossible to pinpoint any particular vehicle or person. The anxiety was almost suffocating, and the mundane drive home suddenly felt like an eerie journey. I decided not to go straight home. Instead, I took a detour to the nearest police station. The whole drive felt surreal, my eyes darting to every passing car and shadow. When I arrived at the station, I recounted the entire incident to the officers. They listened attentively, but they seemed skeptical. With no concrete evidence or immediate threat, they advised me to stay vigilant, did little else. I left the station feeling a mix of relief and lingering dread. Police couldn't offer much help, and I was left to deal with my fear on my own. That night, sleep was elusive. Every noise outside seemed amplified. Every shadow cast by streetlights seemed menacing. I kept my phone close, ready to call the police if needed. Over the next few days, the strange messages and calls ceased. The paranoia remained. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, especially in crowded places. The once simple act of walking to Subway became a trigger for anxiety. I avoided using my phone in public, wary of unknown numbers and potential threats. The incident, though seemingly trivial compared to more serious crimes, left an indelible mark on me. It served as a stark reminder of how vulnerable we can be, even in our routine lives. It also reinforced my belief in the unpredictability of human behavior and the importance of remaining aware of our surroundings. To this day, I still remember that unsettling feeling and the eerie voice on the phone. It's a haunting reminder that sometimes the ordinary can quickly become frightening, and the shadows of our daily lives can hold more than we're prepared to confront. Story 5. I need to recount an unsettling experience that occurred at my workplace recently. I've been working at this Subway for almost a year, and while I've encountered various customers, nothing prepared me for the bizarre and frightening events of that afternoon. It was a quiet time of day, probably between 2 and 3 p.m., the lull between lunch and dinner. The store was typically calm during this period. My coworker was in the back preparing supplies, leaving me alone at the counter. The tranquility was almost eerie, a sharp contrast to the usual bustling atmosphere during peak hours. A man walked in, and from the moment he stepped through the door, I felt an inexplicable sense of discomfort. He came straight to the counter and, with a gruff tone, demanded one of the $5 footlong. I knew immediately something was off. $5 footlong promotion had been discontinued for years. It was a relic of a bygone era, and no one had seen such a deal in quite some time. I tried to gently inform him that the promotion was no longer available. To my surprise, he reacted with visible agitation. He started ranting about how Subway used to advertise the $5 footlong and how, in his last visit, he had been able to get one. His anger was palpable, and I could see that he was genuinely upset, though I couldn't understand why he held on to such an old grievance. He demanded to know the current price and, upon hearing it, his frustration boiled over. He accused me of misleading customers and threatened to contact Subway's corporate office and my manager. His anger was disproportionate to the situation, and it became clear he was not going to calm down easily. He then asked how much I was willing to lower the price, as if we were haggling at a flea market. I explained that I didn't have the authority to adjust prices. This only fueled his rage further. He began cursing at me, his face red with fury. At this point, I was fed up and told him to leave the store. His reaction was immediate and hostile. He continued to yell and rant, concluding with a chilling threat. "I'll be back for you." My coworker, who had finally come out of the back room, was equally disturbed by the situation. He backed me up, telling the man to leave. The man stormed out, but his threat hung heavily in the air. We both felt a profound sense of relief when he was gone, but the discomfort lingered. As the evening progressed, the store became busy again, but eventually it quieted down. My coworker went home, and I was left alone to close up. This time of night was usually very quiet, with only a few stragglers coming in before we shut down. At 9 p.m., I locked the doors and began my closing duties. That's when things took a disturbing turn. While I was in the back cleaning, I heard persistent banging on the front door. My heart sank as I looked up to see the same angry man from earlier. He had returned, and he was not happy. He was pounding on the door, his face pressed against the glass. his eyes wild with rage. I felt a surge of panic. I tried to ignore him, hoping he would eventually leave, but he didn't. Instead, he began shouting obscenities through the glass, his voice muffled but still audible. The noise was unsettling, and I felt a growing sense of dread. I retreated to the back, trying to calm myself and figure out what to do. When I checked again, he was still outside, now pacing back and forth on the sidewalk. His erratic movements and the way he kept glancing back at the door were deeply unsettling. It was clear he was waiting for me, and his presence made me feel trapped and vulnerable. I knew I needed to take action. I called the police, explaining the situation and how the man was still outside, causing a disturbance. The wait for the officers felt interminable, each minute stretching longer than the last. I remained hidden in the back, my anxiety growing with every knock and shout. Finally, the police arrived. They spoke to the man and after some tense negotiations managed to convince him to leave. The sense of relief I felt was overwhelming. I quickly finished my tasks and locked up, eager to leave the store and put this disturbing incident behind me. Reflecting on that day, I feel a mix of gratitude and lingering unease. If I hadn't locked the doors right at closing time, I shuddered to think what might have happened. The man's behavior was erratic and threatening. His return after hours added an extra layer of fear to an already unsettling situation. Since that incident, I haven't seen the man again. I'm hopeful I never will. The experience has left me with a heightened sense of vigilance and a reminder of how quickly a routine day can spiral into something frightening. It's a stark reminder that even in seemingly safe places, danger can be lurking just around the corner. Story 6. My name is Lisa, and I'm 15 years old. My house is conveniently located right next to a Subway restaurant, a fact that has always felt oddly comforting but also a bit unsettling. You see, living next door to a fast food chain might sound convenient, but it also means you're constantly reminded of its presence. It all started on a Tuesday afternoon. I had just come back from school, my stomach growling with hunger. As usual, I glanced over at Subway and something caught my eye, a bright yellow sign that read "Free sub today." I was skeptical. Free food? There's always a catch, right? But with my hunger outweighing my doubts, I decided to give it a try. I walked into the restaurant, and to my surprise, it was almost empty. The usual hustle and bustle of lunchtime had subsided, and there was only a quiet, eerie calm inside. Mr. Jenkins, the manager, was behind the counter. His face lit up with an unnervingly wide smile as he greeted me. "Welcome, Lisa. Your free sub is ready," he said, his tone oddly enthusiastic. I took the sub, wrapped in plain white paper, and thanked him. As I left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The sub tasted fine, but there was a strange, metallic aftertaste that lingered. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just my imagination. The next day, I was greeted with the same sign, "Free sub today." This time, I approached Subway with more apprehension, but my curiosity got the better of me. Mr. Jenkins was waiting outside, smile as wide as ever. "Lisa, you're just in time," he exclaimed, handing me another sub. I took it, feeling increasingly uncomfortable. The sub's filling was the same as the previous day, strangely flavored and unsettling. I tried to ignore the creeping anxiety and went home, but that night I heard peculiar noises coming from Subway. Soft scratching sounds and what seemed like muffled whispers. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. By the third day, my unease had grown. I walked to Subway, dreading what I might find. The door was slightly ajar, and the interior was shrouded in an eerie half-light. A woman I didn't recognize was working behind the counter. Her face was blank, and her movements were robotic. "Another free sub for you, Lisa," she said in a monotone voice. I took the sub, noticing a pungent smell emanating from it. It reminded me of something rotting. I ate it quickly, my stomach churning with each bite. That night, the noises from Subway were louder, more insistent. The scratching and whispering were accompanied by what sounded like distant wailing. I lay in bed, paralyzed with fear. On the fourth day, my anxiety reached new heights. As I approached Subway, I noticed strange symbols drawn on the window in chalk. They looked like crude, occult symbols, and they sent a shiver down my spine. Inside, the atmosphere was unsettling. The woman was there again, her eyes empty and distant. She handed me my sub, which was wrapped in a different kind of paper, brown and stained. The smell was nauseating, and I barely managed to eat it. That night, the noises grew louder and more chaotic. The whispers turned into frantic murmurs, and the scratching became almost unbearable. I was convinced something malevolent was happening next door. By the fifth day, I was determined to get to the bottom of this. I walked to Subway with a sense of dread. The door was wide open, and the inside was dimly lit. Mr. Jenkins was behind the counter, his grin more sinister than ever. "Hello, Lisa. Here's your free sub," said, his voice dripping with an unsettling sweetness. I took the sub and went home, but this time I had no intention of eating it. Instead, I decided to investigate. As night fell, I sneaked out and went to the back of Subway. I peered through a small window and saw a horrifying scene inside. The restaurant was illuminated by flickering candles, and strange occult symbols covered the walls. In the center of the room, Mr. Jenkins was performing a dark ritual. He chanted in a language I didn't recognize, and the room was filled with an ominous, pulsating energy. The sight was so terrifying that I froze, unable to move. Mr. Jenkins' eyes met mine through the window, and his grin widened into something almost predatory. Panicked, I stumbled back and ran home, my heart racing. I locked all the doors and windows, desperately trying to calm myself. On the sixth day, I was filled with a sense of foreboding as I approached Subway. The store was completely dark. The sign, "Closed for renovations," hanging in the window. Mr. Jenkins was nowhere to be seen, and the woman was absent too. I took a deep breath and decided to investigate further. I walked around the back of the restaurant, where I noticed the back door was slightly ajar. Summoning all my courage, I pushed the door open and slipped inside. The interior was a disaster. Tables were overturned, and the walls were smeared with strange symbols and dark stains. The once clean restaurant now looked like a scene from a nightmare. I heard a soft, eerie humming coming from the back room. Creeping towards the noise, I found Mr. Jenkins sitting cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by candles and strange artifacts. His eyes were closed, and he was mumbling incoherently. The atmosphere was thick with malevolence, and I could feel an oppressive weight pressing down on me. Suddenly, Mr. Jenkins' eyes snapped open, and he looked directly at me. His expression was a mix of anger and satisfaction, as if he had been expecting me. I stumbled backward, my fear overwhelming me. Without warning, Mr. Jenkins stood up and advanced towards me, his movements deliberate and menacing. I turned and fled, running out of the restaurant and back to my house. I locked myself in, feeling a cold sweat break out across my forehead. I knew I had to tell someone, but I was too terrified to move. The aftermath. The next morning, Subway was closed, and a new sign read, "Under new management." When the restaurant finally reopened, everything seemed normal, almost too normal. Mr. Jenkins and the woman were nowhere to be seen, and the atmosphere inside was benign. But I knew better. I avoided Subway after that experience, and I tried to forget about those terrifying days. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear strange whispers and see fleeting shadows out of the corner of my eye. I hope I never have to encounter whatever dark force was behind that restaurant again.